Welcome to the Cadence Beginner's Guide to Angling. In this series of short instructional videos, our aim is to show you all the basics you'll need to get you started, and most of all, catching some fish. Enjoy! In this episode of Beginner's Guide, we're going to look at stick float fishing on rivers. And stick float fishing is such an effective way of fishing on a river. And it's basically best used when you're not having to cast too far out. Certainly when you're a beginner, it's a bit of a tricky method to master, and you want to be fishing perhaps within 2 rod lengths of the bank. That will make control and casting a lot easier. Stick float fishing is so effective because it can present the bait very, very well. And in particular, smaller baits like maggots and casters, when you're fishing for silver fish like roach, dace, and even bigger fish like chub and barbel. So stick float fishing has evolved over the years, and there's a tremendous array of different float sizes and patterns that you can choose from. You'll notice that nearly all float patterns have a capacity on there. In this case, that's 14 number 4. So that means 14 number 4 shot. This smaller one here has a capacity of 4 number 4 shot. And that's really important to consider to match the right size of float to the river and specifically the swim that you're fishing in. Depth is an important factor, and so is the power of the flow. So I've selected some different stick floats here that will help cater for these different situations. These floats on the left have got a wire stem design, and you can see that they're different capacities, but they're common with this wire stem. And that wire enables the float to have some weight, which makes it easier to cast, and it also makes the float very stable within the flow of the river. So if you've got a turbulent boilie peg, you want to go for a wire stem. These floats are the more traditional style, where you've got 2 materials. You've got cane or a heavy base, either lignum wood or heavy plastic, and these also have their own characteristics. The cane float is great when you're catching fish on the drop. As the hook bait and the shot are settling, you can actually read the bites as the stem of the float will settle quite slowly. The heavier base stick floats will cock much quicker, but the big advantage with them, like the wire stem, is they've got some weight in the float and they help to cast effectively and also to control the float. You'll notice that these stick floats have all got different types of tips and different types of body shape. Larger bulbous tips like that one are great when you're fishing at longer range, so when you're trotting the float way down your peg, you can see the float much better. Also when you're fishing bigger baits, because the tip rather, is more buoyant. These floats are more sensitive, and this one's actually got a plastic insert which is hollow, which shows up really well in bad light conditions. So, shotting patterns for a stick float. Probably the most common and popular is what's referred to as a shirt button shotting pattern. So literally taken from the plating of shirt buttons, you've got the shot spaced equally out. And it's interesting to note that in this case, on this stick float, I've actually used number 8 shots. So it's a 6 number 4. I could have used 6 number 4s instead of number 8s, but I want to have more number 8s incorporated within the rig. That's why I've used the smaller shots. It's a big benefit because it improves presentation and also gives great flexibility with the rig. When you've got this spread out shotting pattern, you get a lovely fall of the bait through the water, which is absolutely a perfect presentation when you're loose feeding maggots. It also is very easy and effective to cast. Contrary to what you might think, having more shot on the rig like that will cause less tangles than perhaps having 3 or 4 bigger shot. The other advantage, as I mentioned, in the flexibility of the rig is I can change that presentation from an on the drop shirt button style to a bulked shotting pattern, which I'm doing now. So I'm basically moving nearly all the number 8s together to form a bulk, and I've got 3 number 8s below to just give me a little nice fall once that bulk's got the bait down. I might use that kind of shotting pattern if I'm fishing in a deeper, more powerful peg where I need to get the bait down near the bottom, or if I'm trying to avoid smaller nuisance fish and get down to where the bigger fish are feeding. Sometimes presentation can be difficult when you're fishing a stick float. Because you've got the float attached top and bottom, the line above the float can be affected by wind, and in particular a downstream wind, which can really make stick float fishing difficult. A good tip is to incorporate what we call a back shot, actually above the float. So I'm going to pinch, in this case, a number 8 shot just above the float, and by positioning that maybe 4 inches to 8 inches above the float, you'll be able to control the float much easier in a downstream wind. An important factor to think about when you stick float, and indeed whenever you're float fishing really, is to know the depth of the peg that you're fishing. And the most effective way to do that quickly, especially when you're using a stick float, is to use a plummet. So that's a heavy weight that's attached to the bottom of the line that's going to pull the float under if you're not fishing on the bottom. So I'll just show you. I'm going to just gently swing the plummet and the float into position, and I can see there that I'm actually fishing about a float's length over depth. So I can very quickly adjust that by moving the float down the line, and we'll just double check with the plummet again. You can see I'm just lowering the plummet in so I'm not splashing it into the water, and I know now that that is exactly the depth of the swim in front of me. Now that depth may change, it often does on rivers. Rivers are very seldom uniform, so as you trot down the river may deepen off, it may shallow up, but that's a good start. And if I start fishing and my float keeps dragging under, I know I'm fishing too deep. If I think the float's not dragging under, I know I can go deeper. And a good tip to reference and remember how deep your swim is during the session is to actually measure the depth against your rod. In this case, I've put the hook in the keeper ring and I can count 1, 2, 3, 4 guides up. So if I was to get a tangle and set up again, or maybe need to change my hook length, I've got a good reference to get back to the right depth. Stick float fishing is quite a busy method, given the fact that you're constantly trotting and casting the float into the swim. And also when you combine with perhaps one of the most important factors of all fishing, and that's feeding. So you need to get into a really good routine of casting, feeding and trotting the float down through the swim. And it's great to be able to do that where you've got your hook bait in amongst the loose feed. And as you can see, I've got a fish. It's not a big fish, but by fishing like that you can soon build up a really respectable weight of small fish, and on another day even bigger fish. Rod wise, for stick float fishing on rivers, I recommend that you look at rod lengths between 13 and 15 foot. The extra length really helps when you're controlling a float like a stick float in a river. This is our 13 foot match combo, It's matched with a 3000 size open face reel. An important point you can see is that we've loaded that reel perfectly with line. So it enables the line to peel off very easily when you're casting with lighter floats, and also when you're trotting the float through the swim. The actual line that you use when you're float fishing on rivers is very important as well. And this is just £3 line, which is a good quality floating line. And obviously that helps to control the float whilst you're trotting it down the swim. If you're using a line that kept sinking, it'd make it very difficult. It's also important to note that it is quite light. The tackle's very balanced. If I was trying to fish for stick float with a heavier line like 6 or 8 pound, it would prove very, very difficult. Stick float fishing, a method well worth mastering.